Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining again. Um, I'm excited to introduce my conversation with David Fuller, who is the co-founder of the channel Rebel Wisdom. And before I give some more context around that, a few housekeeping things. So links below for all of my offerings through the Circle Institute, which is my company. We are doing everything online right now. So it's a real good opportunity if you've been thinking about it, but have been limited to be able to get to San Francisco, to come and participate in circling and learn more about that. We have a Thursday night open event where anyone's welcome. It's a 3-hour drop-in event. So the link's below. It's best to get the info off the Facebook page, which is provided below. Also, if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, go ahead and email me. And I think that's it for now. So this is a really great conversation. It'd been quite a while. It was like last summer, the last time I talked with David. However, one of the things I really appreciated in the conversation was a lot of things kind of coming together, I think, for David and for myself. A deeper understanding about what Rebel Wisdom and David in particular is really doing on multiple levels, and with his channel and his work and the choices that they've made there. You know, because David comes from, in particular, this is the thing I really appreciated, was that David comes from a more of a traditional media background at NBC and BBC, and he is an example, kind of a rare example of someone who was deeply in that world very ethically and has transitioned out of the mainstream social media into whatever this is that we're watching right now. Still yet to be defined. However, him bringing a lot of those sensibilities to bear in a real positive way, and being a witness to to the change in media as a whole, but from inside of it. So we got into a lot of that and what that was like for him, and examples where that is happening, and other places and people where that isn't happening. And it's a really enlightening conversation. So I really enjoyed it a lot. And we talked about a video where he had watched recently that I think he had done right when they started the channel. So I'll include a link for that below, so you can watch that, where he listened to what he thought the future was of that channel and what they were up to. And whatever, over a year later, he watches it again and realizes that he's right in the middle of what he thought was coming. So it has this conversation has that glimmer of emergent intelligibility, kind of crackled a few times. It was really great. So hope to do it again with him soon. Enjoy. Hello, David.
Hey, Guy.
We just hit the record button.
Yeah.
So we were just talking about your everything is slowed down or locked down around you, but Rebel Wisdom is cooking. You're busier than you've ever been.
Yeah. I sort of see people on Facebook talking about how they're kind of bored and they've watched everything on Netflix and they're not sure what to do next and what happens when life gets back to normal. And a friend of mine posted something like, what habits from the lockdown are you going to carry on when you get back to normal? And people saying, oh, I'm going to make more space in my life. And that's not my reality and hasn't been since, I guess, kind of, it's the same for my friends back in journalism as well. Like when the news ramps up, they're very, very busy. But that's what I've found since the beginning of this is not enough hours in the day to do all of the things that
Hmm.
need to be done, and just an expansion on every level of the business effectively, the Rebel Wisdom. So there's the films. We've done a couple of big online events.
Hmm.
In some ways, it's kind of focused us a lot more clearly, because we were doing some in-person events and some online events, but it's been very clear. It's like, no, now you're an online business, whether you like it or not.
Right.
Um,
In which side of the fence are you on that one? Like it or not?
it's, I mean, the in-person events, certainly the festival last year and the festival this year was going to be our sort of high point. So the fact that we've had to bring that online,
Yeah.
feels a sense, yeah, there's a disappointment that there are lots of people who are going to be flying in from around the world who we've been connecting with on Zoom for many months. And that was going to be a big event, potentially up to like 300, 400 people in London.
Right.
So the fact that that's not happening is disappointing.
Right.
But at the same time, I actually feel the focus that comes from knowing that all of the energy is now going into building online community is actually quite good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There was always this sort of difficulty of trying to do both, because we run retreats, so we really value, like, we know that there's something you can do in person that you can't do online.
Yeah.
We'd always been sort of split between, well, do we do more in-person retreats or do we do more online community? And the fact that we've had that option taken away makes things a little bit clearer, I think.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we're kind of going through something as well. Like I put off doing all the stuff online, all of my courses and stuff like that online for as long as possible. And then of course this happened and it just forced us into it. Now we're realizing, like, it's very difficult to not, I mean, that's interesting in itself, just the fact of how easy it is to be online, right? And like how practical it is on so many different levels.
Yeah.
But it works actually. It's funny. I'm surprised with working with groups and stuff like that it actually works pretty well, like surprisingly well. So it works, but I'm with you about, there's nothing like, a room full of people, like getting into it. Like there's nothing like the oxytocin and all the serotonin and all the dopamine that gets going in that space. That's there's nothing like that, for sure. Last time we talked, I think you had just gotten back from Burning Man. And one of the things that struck me about that conversation was how much you were kind of in the process of kind of finding what you were doing as you were doing it. It's almost like I got this sense of what you were up to with Rebel Wisdom, that you were in some sense authoring it. However, you weren't clear exactly your role in the authorship, right? That it was like a literally a conversation that you were having. And it sounds like when I've heard you speak lately, it sounds like it's turned a little bit more. You're more clear about the direction that you're going, and it's not, at least what I'm hearing more. Just to, update me with this, but it sounds like that you've really turned a corner in terms of taking on practice and providing a space for the practice of the psychotechnologies and all the things that have been talking about. Is that true? How do you see yourself now in Rebel Wisdom?
Yeah, I guess we did a big free one-day event on the 5th, and that was a sort of, it was called Resilience and Sense Making, and it had kind of a framing at the beginning with Jamie Wheel and Diane Musho Hamilton talking about kind of like the big picture, and then after that we did lots of breakouts with practices of about, I think we have 3 breakouts running at the same time, and they're up to about 100 people in each breakout each time. And then sub breakouts within those doing different practices, from inquiry to breath work to movement, and that felt very, it's probably the first time that we've done an event that really felt like it gelled quite as well. Like we had the sense making, we had the kind of big picture intellectual content, but then we also drew a very clear line to, well, if you want to make sense, well, you have to do the work.
Yeah.
You want to be resilient. Part of being resilient is understanding what's going on.
Right.
Maybe understanding what the deeper shifts are that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Like if this is the end of the old system and it's going to feel like a death in a lot of ways, understanding what that might mean kind of systematically and intellectually is going to help us feel a bit more grounded and resilient. But then there's also the work of, wow, how do I feel about this?
Yeah.
And how do I give voice to that and to go through the process of like this sort of sense of, and the other thing as well, since the beginning of this crisis, I looked back at the film that we made 2 years ago to sort of say, what is Rebel Wisdom? And it all fits with what's happening right now. Like I watched it, I made that film, and yet when I watched it again, I watched it almost with new eyes. Like it says at the beginning, this is the descent. We're going through the breakdown of the old system, and everything that we've been doing with Rebel Wisdom since the beginning has been like, suddenly I even read copy that I've written, which before probably only a few people in this kind of, there isn't really a good name for it, the meta web, the sense making web, the sort of, the kind of people that I know you are in dialogue with as well, who've been saying, wow, we're in a meaning crisis, we're in some kind of a real systematic crisis, and that's going to unfold. Now I think that's becoming really clear to everyone.
Yeah, totally.
So I think maybe you feel the same, but just this sense of, since the beginning of this crisis, just this deep sense of alignment and focus and purpose has been just like this absolutely kind of solid core of, this is exactly what we've been preparing for and tracking on some level since the beginning of Rebel Wisdom, and probably since kind of my background before I created Rebel Wisdom. Like this was, and we're now in a time where the news, like the updates of the news, needs that deeper level, like understanding systems thinking, understanding complexity, understanding, but you can't actually make sense of even the day-to-day right now without some of those deeper lenses. Yeah. And then maybe you even need to go back to like the mythopoetic lens of what is the kind of this, as Jordan Hall, who I know you've been in dialogue with quite a bit, talks about, there's some knowledge that is so important but so rarely used that we store it in the mythopoetic layer. Like they're in our deepest stories. It's the sort of thing that we may only need once every couple of generations or once every millennium. That's where we store it. That's why we have those stories, and that's why they resonate so deeply, is that this is going to come in useful sometime. And so there's this sense of those of us who've been looking at the world through that kind of deeper mythopoetic layer. This is when the rubber meets the road, and so many of the people that I've been talking to, and even in the Rebel Wisdom community, our group calls, there's just been this sense of like focus and purpose, and like so many people saying, yes, these are the times I was built for. This is what I've been preparing for without realizing it for the last however many years. So there's this sense, and then when I look back at some of the material that we've put out on Rebel Wisdom, I think, wow, it just looks so prescient right now. All of these people that I've been interviewing, and like these incredible thinkers, tracking what they've been saying, it's like, there's a sense that many of us have been sensing this, and in some ways feeling like, okay, this was going to happen.
Literally you've been sensing it. and responding to it, right? And so it sounds like you had so when you looked at, is that the glitch in the Matrix? Which film is that you're talking about that you watched of?
Oh, I'm talking about actually the 2.5 minute film that was, it's called What is Rebel Wisdom?
Mm-hmm.
So it's literally just the
Oh, okay.
very short clips, and we can maybe put it in the show notes for
Yeah,
anyone watching who wants to see it.
that'd be really, really interesting. Yeah,
But
because
yes,
it's kind of interesting what you're doing, because it's you could look at the way that you've been talking about what you've been doing and your future, and then come back and look at it and then compare notes. And I mean, even that's a trip.
yeah,
I mean, that itself is like a way of making sense and honing yourself up. It's like a feedback loop that's really quite. And then the feedback that you're getting from because now that you have participants, right? You don't just have audiences, but you have participants, right? And you're getting
yeah.
feedback, and it's a very interesting. You're in a really unusual, it seems to me, a really unusual position.
It's hard for me to say whether it's unusual. It's quite usual for me now.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Totally. The 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 sense of, I was thinking about, as we were going to have this conversation, I was thinking about um your history is within mainstream media, right? Like you worked for NBC and BBC.
Yeah, mostly Channel 4 News. I was in the Channel 4 newsroom for about 10 years, but I've
Right.
made films for the BBC. I started at the BBC and then I've made films for
Yeah.
them since I left.
So that in those institutions, right? It's interesting because I've been putting on like the NBC nightly news, and the music comes on and breaking news today, and and it hits all those anchors from when I was a kid, of this experience of like everything would stop when I was a kid, when Dan Rather would come on, right? And everyone would go around. There would be something like, there were no questions about what we were watching, and it was so almost ritualistic.
Yeah.
And I noticed that, like, although it hits all those anchors for me, I remember those. But when I look at that thing, I'm like, it's so clear that something else is happening than what I thought was happening back then. It's just like the mainstream media is breaking down at such a level and changing so deeply. It's just, you get the sense that they don't know where they are. However, it's been the institutions that have grounded us, right, in so many ways. And so it's really interesting to think about, like, when I was thinking about you having to some degree been in that world and then coming out of that world, in some ways you're an example of I think Jordan Hall talks about that as like that's all part of the blue church, right? And what's the next one after that? Is there another?
We talked about the insurgency being the red religion.
Yeah.
Sort of the blue church. I mean, I think it's a very, very useful frame. The blue church being the institution of not just the media, but also the whole institution of like top-down hierarchy and the deep state and all of the academia, so Harvard, all of these systems that were designed to organize the world after the Second World War, and that they were very effective, but they'd also left out certain viewpoints, certain perspectives, and that was what fueled the insurgency and the red religion, and then sort of bubbled up with Trump and Brexit, sort of kind of what was left out of the blue church synthesis.
Right.
I mean, that's what my first film was about, was sort of the glitch in the matrix, was exactly that. What are these perspectives that are not being reflected in the system that we have, which is effectively that reality is far too complex to be contained within any low resolution model.
Yeah.
And I'd say the Blue Church model was actually fairly high resolution, but it's still not enough. And there are certain values and certain perspectives that are not included. And also that there's a kind of, it becomes corrupt, or it becomes, corrupt is possibly not the right word, but it's certainly become, there's a what is the right word? It sort of atrophies a little bit. Like it atrophies as time goes by.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, I guess, I mean, that's what I'm most fascinated by, I think, is this sort of tension between the alternative and the mainstream.
Yeah.
And also concerned by, because this is a film that I'm making at the moment about sort of the growth of conspiracy theory and all of these kind of alternative narratives around COVID, which seem to be just proliferating, and you're seeing people who would never have sort of shared a conspiracy theory before sharing stuff. And there's a very complex picture, because some of what people say is conspiracy theory is actually, like, I'm not saying that everything that's not the mainstream narrative is conspiracy theory, because some of the mainstream narrative themselves are partial. But then you've got, what concerns me is you've got the situation where we had gatekeepers before. They weren't perfect, but at least we had some gatekeepers, and there were some very good values held in those gatekeepers that I internalized as a journalist. Like, if you're going to report something, you need to check it factually. You need to get people's responses. If you're going to put any allegations, you need to get the response of whoever you're making the allegation about. And there were enforcement of those, especially in the UK. We've got a very different media landscape than the US. Like, there are genuine checks and balances. And I feel like we've gone from one place where there were the gatekeepers, and there were obviously flaws in that system, but at least there was some sense of objective truth. Right. Into a world, and I can imagine that you go through this kind of through the valley of kind of the alternative media, and we may end up with a more sort of crowdsourced, decentralized way of checking truth claims, but we're not there yet. And we're in this very dangerous place in between one structure and another. And right now we're in a place where it feels like a very dangerous time in a very dangerous time. Because we don't yet have, we've got the tech giants now making these decisions, and they're doing it in a very sort of haphazard way, but because they're also benefiting from, like, conspiracy stuff, or let's say misinformation rather than conspiracy. Misinformation can be very viral. Right. And they're only really interested in maximizing time on site, maximizing shareability of content. So they're not oriented towards truth. So we've got this very dangerous moment when we've got actors who are not oriented towards truth, and then we've got all of these kind of other actors, including state actors like Russia and China, and we've got very few checks and balances, and it seems that we're being overwhelmed. But that for me is very, very concerning, is that I don't see, I hear, like, Jordan Hall, formerly Jordan Greenhall, I think his narrative is brilliant about decentralized media and broadcast, but I also, and he talks about kind of the death of the Blue Church, but it's almost inevitably going towards more and more decentralized, and then the destruction of like the New York Times, all of the institutions, academia, all of these things are losing their power. And it's like, I get that, but that terrifies me. Like the valley, the valley that we have to cross to some other way of making sense, unless we're all, the idea that we all have to individually check absolutely everything and we all have to rely on our discernment, while that feels empowering on some level, it's also, it's not possible. We all proxy our sense making somewhere to something. We do. We can't avoid it. That's how we exist as humans.
We have to categorize.
So it's like, this feels like, it feels very, very worrying. I think that more than anything, like the information landscape and the lack of faith in any authorities I mean, to be fair, they've done an awful lot to lose our trust. I mean, I'm not defending the existing authorities, but the fact that we have no trusted sources anymore and cannot even really imagine what a trusted source would look like, who would be heard and respected on both sides of the political divide, or all sides of the political, like you mentioned Dan Rather before, like that kind of figure of someone who is trusted by everyone. I can't even imagine what that would look like right now.
Right. Yeah.
That was a long rap, but it's
yeah. Well, one of the things you said is, yeah, as a journalist coming from that side of the street, like you've internalized, right, certain ethics. So that was something that actually, like, you still have that, right? Like you still have that.
Yeah, and I'd like to say something there, because I think, like, there are values held within like good journalism, journalistic ethics, that I think are we can't lose those. Like, a lot of people are very down on journalism, and I'd agree with a lot of the criticisms. Like, journalism is far too easily captured by groupthink. It's captured by corporate interests. It's captured by a lot of these other factors. But if you break down what journalism should be about, kind of good treatment of information, they're really valuable things. They're valuable practices, and they're valuable values. And the practices, like I've been tracking, like the intellectual dark web, for example, which is, for people who maybe don't know, is a kind of loose conglomeration of podcasts and alternative media figures. And I've seen them go through this process of real world learning that they have to have these values. You saw it with someone like Joe Rogan, who's the biggest podcaster in the world. He went through this process he had Jack Dorsey, the head of Twitter, on his podcast. And it was a crappy interview. Jack Dorsey just basically stonewalled everything and Joe afterwards kind of was like, yeah, that was a crappy interview. But his audience just turned on him in a way that he'd never experienced before, because they were like, you didn't hold him to account. Twitter have been censoring people. They've been banning people. You didn't. And Joe was like, whoa, I just get people on to I just built this show by getting on people I want to talk to and having a conversation with them. And suddenly my audience is calling me a traitor, calling me a sellout, calling me a shill for not asking Jack Dorsey and holding him to account about all of these topics. And Joe, you saw him go through this that's what I really respect about Joe Rogan, is that he went through this process of self-analysis and like, I didn't ask for this job, but now I'm being expected to do this job.
Yeah.
And he did the interview with Jack Dorsey again and got on a journalist, Tim Pool, to basically have a go at Jack Dorsey. So he did, but he was learning effectively that he was a journalist without realizing that he had certain responsibilities to his audience that he never asked for. And I think a lot of people in the alternative media space are learning that the reach comes with responsibility. Like, if you have a certain number of, if you've got a few million subscribers, there are different responsibilities to that in the mainstream media. And Eric Weinstein talks about this really well. He says a lot of the people in the old media inherited their positions. So the journalists themselves, they don't have a lot of reach, but the New York Times has a lot of reach. But they've inherited their positions. And he thinks that they probably have a different responsibility to someone who's built their platform by hand or their Twitter account by hand. There probably is a different set of responsibilities. But if you've got 200,000, 1 million followers, I think you do have a certain set of responsibilities. They're very different. Like, what we're seeing right now with coronavirus and misinformation is that everyone, in the same way that you could infect someone as you go out, like, you're not just keeping your safe self from the virus, you're keeping other people safe from the virus and not becoming a vector. I think everyone's now getting a visceral understanding of that you could also be a vector for misinformation. And that, if we're realizing that, and I think we are, then we're also realizing that some people are much more toxic vectors for information than others. And I think this is something we're learning very quickly right now.
It's an interesting time when being a journalist is an emergent property,
Mm.
right? Like
Yeah.
Joe Rogan, it emerged for him that he's a journalist. He's finding his way, which is really, I think one of the things that's interesting is like, who is the audience in this world, right? Because one of the things I've had this thought about watching Peterson was, and I get that people have different opinions about this, but like, I like him. I just have a lot of respect for like how he would just walk. I don't know if he knew who he was talking to when he was talking, but he just walk in and he would just confront the hypocrisy, right? He would confront, and he wouldn't, and he would just stay to the truth. I thought he was a great example of that. But one of the things that I think what started to happen, at least in my view, at the end sometimes, right, was actually something that he used to talk about in his class, when he would talk about that Hitler, right, wasn't just, he didn't come out like Hitler and then insert something on the world. No, like there was an evolution where certain things he would say, he would get like a cheer. And so on some level, not even like at the conscious level, but just in the dance of co-creating, Germany and Hitler co-created each other at that time. And I was actually kind of watching as time went on, like it seemed to me that he talked a lot more. His audience got really like against the postmodernism, right? Against those people, right? And he got a lot of applause for that. And he just, it occurred to me that he started taking the language of more and more polarization, in a way that I think that was very similar to that same dynamic, right? So he had a real cult following, and I don't think I'm not calling him Hitler or anything like that, but there's a dynamic that there's a co-shaping that's going on, right? And so you just gave an example of where that went really well, right? Or reasonably well with Joe Rogan, right? Where he has this interview, he's just doing his thing, right? And then he starts to get, but that was a conscious thing that he confronted and made adjustments around, and maybe sees himself differently through that. Like that's really, is this like that in itself is just an interesting thing that can just happen or emerge for you.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting dynamic that's coming up, or I'm thinking about as you're talking, which is the idea of anti-fragility, which is that more conflict makes us stronger. And there seems to be a parallel there in terms of, does criticism, do we shrink under criticism and just retreat into, I know best and this person's wrong and I don't know why they're saying that anyway? Or do we actually, are we able to grow into criticism? And that is something, again, just referring back to the intellectual dark web, you saw very different trajectories between Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin. Dave Rubin, I've done an interview with him where I was quite challenging, and one thing I think it's fairly controversial to say, the one thing Dave Rubin's not very good at is taking criticism. Mm-hmm. He does seem to have a pretty strong narcissistic edge, and he, even on, like, he's very, very thin-skinned. Yeah. And it's interesting because he's talked about, I mean, even Joe Rogan talked about how he hinted that he was sort of mentally not particularly, what did he say? Something like effectively pretty dumb. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of stupidity that comes from not being able to take criticism that means that you get stuck. Yeah. And that I've noticed quite a lot since I've sort of got more into personal growth. Like, there's a type of stupidity that is just lack of probably cognitive ability that people have more or less of. But there's a certain type of intelligence that just comes from being able to grow in terms of criticism, openness, and challenge, that I see with someone like Joe Rogan. And actually it makes Joe Rogan a really intelligent interviewer and a really like he would be the first to say he's not a philosopher, or he's not a particularly deep thinker, but he's actually a very, very, very good interviewer, because
Right.
he's constantly growing and he's constantly learning.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also got a very good sense for when someone is getting stuck in certainty. And you see, like, some of his interviews, he's actually picking up very intuitively when someone doesn't know what they're talking about, because he can kind of sense into what they're kind of speaking from a very fixed position, or they're open, and he just pushes back quite gently.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something in, I don't know, have you like, there's almost two different types of intelligence there. And becoming fixated in a position means that you stop growing.
Mm-hmm.
And being aware of where that is.
Yeah.
It can happen at any point. Like, that's another really interesting point, is that we don't know. Like, when we're in a relationship with someone and it's growing, and we just get to too much of a core wound, maybe.
Right.
It's like, I can't go beyond there right now.
Right.
I can't accept that responsibility of the dynamic of what's mine here.
Yeah.
I found that in so many relationships.
It's great. I mean, I think it's a great. It's interesting. I've never quite looked at it from the lens of that dynamic actually affecting a certain kind of intelligence or acuity, right, of perception. But that makes sense. It's like if we call it a kind of narcissism, where my ideology or my way of thinking is so wrapped up with who I need to see myself as, right? Yeah. And therefore, if that's the case, I'll only be around people and talk with people that will mirror that to me. So it's not a knowledge that I'm learning. It's a knowledge I'm imposing, getting mirrored.
Yeah.
And if I open up, if I am that image and I need its reflection, if I open up to criticism, right? If I'm really identified, I can't tolerate it, right? So I'll make them wrong, or avoid them, or something like that, and then just be around the people that will, concur with me. And yeah, you're right. Like, that's a very different thing. Whereas what it takes to actually open up to conflict and to criticism and to exposure and to take criticism, that's character. Isn't it? That's character. It's like being able to go through something difficult that you don't understand, and then lean into it and take a look and adjust. And that interaction or that conversation seems to be what makes our character, seems.
Yeah, it is character, but it's also infinitely more difficult to do that if we have a public persona, or we have a public profile. Yeah. That seems to be very, very difficult to do.
Yeah.
Because we get identified with certain perspectives, and admitting that we're wrong in public, and even just the sheer data overwhelm of however many people telling us that we're great, and maybe some people telling us that we're not. And we've got an infinite amount of perspectives, and it's very easy to sort of select only the ones that tell us that we're great, and ignore everyone else.
Yeah.
Like that. I don't know. Something, I have a suspicion that just becoming really famous, it's almost impossible not to have that feedback loop disrupted quite fundamentally.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'm wondering about, so it seemed like when you brought up the thing about the intelligence aspect, right? Or growing, right?
Yeah, certainly it's a line of development, I'd say, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And there's a kind of what happened is for me in the conversation, all of a sudden the conversation shifted, right? We're like both like, oh, there's things that we've thought about. However, in the dialogue, something came up, and now there's almost a sense of like we're bringing things together and articulating them in new ways. So to me, that is whatever that is, and being able to have these conversations. This is, I guess, is what you would call sense making, right? What John and I have been talking a lot about is like dialogos, right? Not just dialogue, like relating, but actually where we encounter a place where all of a sudden we start to learn more than the sum of the two of us knew, right? So that's one of the things I've just been like finding myself zeroing in on what I'm doing with what I'm still finding out what I'm doing, right? In terms of these videos and stuff. But I'm wondering about, like, to me it sounds like wouldn't you say that like your inclination to do the practice work with people, right? Wouldn't you say that a lot of that practice work is precisely about being able to open up to the other, tolerate ambiguity, tell the truth, and stay with what's happening and make sense of it as it happens?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. That's very much. Yeah, that's very much the skill set that I've been learning. So I did a counseling training based around inquiry. So inquiry, I know that you
H almost, like kind of based in H almost.
The Almas work. I mean, it sort of feels like it has the same origin as something like circling.
Yeah, it's Socrates. It's Socratic, basically. Yeah,
Socratic dialogue. And this sense of kind of trying to get to the edge of our understanding and find new words for things. I mean, what I found, I didn't really put this together, and I don't know whether we talked about it before, but maybe not, because I think this was a realization I had relatively recently, which is that so the counseling training I did was based around inquiry. So we were doing an awful lot of that sort of sense of like following the thread of our unfolding experience and learning something new about ourselves in dialogue with someone else, and circling around particular topics and really integrating that kind of way of that way of understanding. And then what I realized was, that's exactly what was fueling Rebel Wisdom. That's exactly what was fueling the exploration was, okay, and this sort of sense of Jordan Peterson being the first like really emergent thing of like, whoa, this is really interesting.
Yeah.
Not just Jordan Peterson. Like I found when I first discovered Jordan Peterson in 2017, I knew immediately that this is the thing. This is the thing that we need, that the world needs to hear right now. Like the deeper mythological, and not the anti-woke stuff and the really kind of anti-pomo material, although I think that there was signal there for sure, but it was more like the deep mythopoetics of our culture, someone arguing for the truth of the religious experience and psychedelics and all these things in the public arena as the most high-profile intellectual. That's an extraordinary thing. And so so that was the first, like, okay, this emergent thing, and then reflecting on that phenomenon that then erupted on the show that I used to work on for 10 years, which is like, okay, pull that one together.
Yeah.
The whole conversation I had with Jordan Peterson when I went to see him in Toronto was about synchronicity. And then he explodes on Channel 4 News with Kathy Newman, who I used to work with many years. It's like, okay, make sense of that synchronicity. And then following the thread of, okay, following that sense of, okay, what is the emergent thing right now? And I think that took me on to the likes of Jordan Hall, Jamie Wheel, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and many other systems thinkers, and like what's the real cutting edge of the conversation, and the intellectual dark web as well. And I've also made I'll also get you to put a link to, I gave a talk about the intellectual dark web in New York to a university, where I kind of, like that sense of the emergent with the intellectual dark web, I think ended quite soon after it was named. But then I look around at some of the people that we're also good friends with. I'm sure that we know many of the same people, people who are practiced in this kind of psychotechnology, also seem to be attracted to some of the same conversations. Like once you develop this as a tool in yourself,
Yeah.
I think you then start to be able to track what is
Yeah.
new and emergent in the culture as well.
Totally. Totally. So there's really something about like, I just, as you're talking about it, when you said, yeah, I knew with Jordan Peterson that this is where a pulse is, right? And you just went
Yeah.
towards it. Before that, right? Before that, like in your life,
Hmm.
what were you up to? Like what were you doing before you saw that and your attention went with Jordan Peterson in the beginning of all of this? Who were you? What were you doing? Why did you exist? What was happening?
Um, so immediately before, I was very passionate about men's work,
Mm-hmm.
and we still some of the so we teach retreats and
Right.
transformational work, and we still, up until this COVID situation, we're doing men's retreats.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very passionate about that.
Right.
Um, and before that, I've been sort of, while I was at Channel 4 News, I was doing a lot of foreign affairs, the Arab Spring, and then left to do documentaries, mostly about foreign affairs.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I was also very interested in, okay, I pitched a few documentaries that never really got made about more spiritual topics. I was always interested in
Mm.
the nexus between spirituality and mental illness.
Mm.
That's something that I've always been interested in.
Mm.
Stanislav Grof, who maybe people might be familiar with, he
Oh
talked
yeah.
about spiritual emergencies,
Mm-hmm.
and just this sense of, I was always interested in what are the areas of culture where a more expansive conception of humanity is pushing through.
Yeah.
So for me, some of those areas were psychedelic therapy. So I did the first piece about psychedelic therapy back in 2008
Mm-hmm.
on mainstream TV in the UK. It was about MDMA therapy and results that have shown that it worked really well.
Yeah.
That, like, why is the psychedelic experience so therapeutically valuable?
Mm-hmm.
That for me shows like how narrow the kind of reductionist conception of people or of the person is from kind of materialistic medicine.
Yeah.
Like, that's one area.
Yeah.
Another area is the sort of idea of spiritual emergencies, and just the, like, psychiatry is an absolute car crash as far as I'm concerned. Like we have no like, we're dealing with complex systems like the psyche.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to look back and say that what we've been doing with drugs in the 20th century, 21st century is medieval. Mm-hmm. Like we'll look at it as how we tried to treat people with leeches back in the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. We just do not understand the psyche. We do not understand the self-healing nature of the psyche. We do not understand like the DSM, that whole paradigm, which I'm going to try and get people to.
Did you call it paradigm?
Yeah, I think we should start using paradigm instead of paradigm. this whole sort of what sometimes gets very amorphous, the idea of paradigm shift.
Yeah,
I've always been, like, from when I studied philosophy, I've always had this sort of sense of what the new paradigm looks like. And then I think together with having sort of honed a sense of where the conversation is, I think that's my sort of, that's what my background has allowed me, like being in a newsroom for 10, 15 years and just getting a sense of where the conversation is, where it gets stuck, where the sort of gatekeepers are of certain ways of sort of seeing the conversation. Mm-hmm. Or where it needs to shift to, and why it gets stuck in certain places. I think that's what I got from that experience of being in a newsroom.
Right. Well, it sounds like I think what I'm hearing you say, it's interesting. It's fractaling a little bit about, so what you talked about with, it's interesting because it sounds like one of the figures in the intellectual dark web, right? That that you're like, this did not go, he did not go in the right direction, right? He's exemplifying it was with David Rubin, right? And you had an intense interview with him, but he stood out for you as doing something different, right? Than what you had your eye on, right? And then we got into a conversation about like an opposite example of that is Joe Rogan, right? Who just, is a comedian, just having his friends on, got really popular. And then the guy from Twitter comes on and he's censoring it. And then his whole fan base kind of turned on him a bit. And then
Joe Rogan's used to being punched in the face. That's the main difference.
Yeah.
I think you can link it to John Vervaeke's idea about embodied, like different forms of knowledge.
Yeah.
Like Joe Rogan is a very embodied
guy.
He's a very embodied thinker, and he's an MMA fighter and commentator. And I think, like, genuinely, I think he thinks much more with his whole body.
Yeah.
And is used to being like, he's not easily knocked off center.
Yeah. And he's also really relational, right?
Yeah.
He's really relational. Like, it's interesting to think about formal fighting as, I mean, you kind of, you have a love affair oftentimes with the guys that you spar with, right? There's a real deep rapport to be able to be vulnerable enough to try to kill you, right? There's a camaraderie there that I think that I remember in my own kind of sport, my background in sports is there is a deep kind of relationality there, but there's a way that he responded that really struck you as the light, kind of like the light side, which was he didn't back into his corner and defend himself. He actually opened up and he's like, well, this is not what well, maybe I need to take on the responsibility because it's here, because maybe now I'm a journalist now, right? And then he had him back on, and then you were tracking him, being able to track conversations which have a little bit more of that gatekeeper quality, or not gatekeeper, but the thing that you internalized from being a journalist of a certain amount of facts. Like, you started to notice his bullshit indicator started to, in his own way, he started to highlight that stuff. You're tracking all of that, right? And what's interesting is when you talked about what I really heard it when you talked about before Rebel Wisdom, you had tried to do documentaries that brought in kind of spirituality, right, and psychiatry, right, the intersections between those two things. And it sounds like, I would imagine, that you just couldn't get the the media at the time was just not what was going on. We're not going to do this. Did you get turned down a lot on a lot of projects, or?
Yeah, I mean, the windows for those kind of, it's very difficult to get something that is going against the dominant narrative.
Yeah.
Because you can always, like, for example, with something, if you're going to talk about the links between spiritual experience and mental illness, for example, then you've got to face the argument that, are you telling people that they should stop taking their medication? Mm-hmm. That is a hugely dangerous thing to be putting out there. We're not going to be responsible for that kind of argument.
Right.
That sort of thing. It's very difficult. I mean, there is an openness now, I think, to a lot of conversations, and also that there's some truth in that. You've got to be careful. Like, you've got to be careful with those kind of arguments. You can't say, because I think a lot of people in the sort of psychologists and people in the medical system are aware of that, like the strong materialist paradigm that your what's going on is just brain chemistry and it has no meaning to what's going on in your life. There are not many people who really think that. Most people are actually in some kind of a understanding that obviously your life experiences influence you in some way, but they're also operating within a paradigm that is pretty much reliant on drugs.
Yes.
And nothing else.
Yes.
Or very little else. Like those overworked doctors will prescribe you antidepressants almost immediately and will not prescribe you talking therapies to understand what's going on in your life. Or So you're fighting you're fighting against a very well-defined system, which has then huge financial interests, which has huge inertia in a certain direction. I mean, there are all of these different factors involved.
Right. And one of the things that I just want to highlight, what looks fractal to me, right? Like a through line that I'm hearing, I think I'm hearing with you is like, even there you were noticing, okay, here's something that's scientific, right? Psychology. And they're addressing things in the name of science that are missing this whole other world, right? That can't be deduced scientifically, let's say. And what's interesting is that you had both the gatekeeper and the sensing at the peripheries, and you didn't just go, well, let's go deeper into the science and deny all of that. You actually wanted to bring them together. You wanted to bring them into conversation. So there's a way in which what I'm hearing is the internalization of like, no, what's reality here? What's actually factual? But you're also saying that it's also factual, right? Or it may be factual that there's a whole other reality that you can't look at in terms of facts in the same way. And if you do, right, it'll become pathological. Like it'll become pathology. There's a way in which there's a through line that I'm hearing through all of that is I'm just appreciating, because I see you and what you guys are doing in Rebel Wisdom is an example of mainstream shifting into this new thing, right? And you're really conscious of this, what it's like to be in mainstream media, the sensibilities, right? And you're also conscious of how it's working, just as demonstrated in this conversation. You're tracking people. You're like you have a pulse on it, but you're also part of the shift and exemplifying the shift and noticing the shift, right? So I just see you as somebody just really on the periphery of something, self-conscious of what you're doing, growing personally. Like I would imagine, well, first of all, how does that sound? That's my recap of what I'm basically hearing, is that there's actually been a through line that you're not just like, what are the facts, but you're also noticing there are worlds that can't be disclosed just through facts, right? And that we need to open up these two worlds and have them in conversations. And I think you're aware of the dangers of any of that stuff becoming kind of an ideology that people just believe, right? And there's a sweet spot there.
Yeah, there's kind of not, it's not an either or, because obviously we don't want to get rid of facts.
Yeah.
Facts have a tendency to impress themselves upon you, whatever happens. I mean, I keep coming back to Ken Wilber's model of sort of the 4 quadrants of knowledge. I think he was essentially right in a lot of the particulars of his models, and so in that sense, then facts really only, well, they occupy two quadrants, but they're not the whole thing. And I think it's a really useful model to make sense of the world and to understand that there are certain things about reality that are irreducible.
Yeah.
And yet we've built a world on very few of we've built a world that emphasizes the material and the quantifiable, and that's it's not enough.
Yeah, totally. It's not enough. And yet you're actually really grounded in those things, and you've been bringing those worlds together, right?
Yeah, trying to.
And what's your like when you just look at you, right? Like you yourself and being a person and watching your own, because there's that sense of like, Buber talks about. I, thou is spoken as one word, right? There's an I that arises. This is a little bit what we were talking about earlier. There's an I that arises with your audience, right? There's I, thou. I'm a different I in some respects than I am with you than I am with somebody else. There's like a co-arising. Who's the I that arises with, has been arising with Rebel Wisdom? Like, have you seen many kind of shifts in your, like, just personally being you, and when you're walking around and looking at trees, and the way you're responding to your relationships and your family, and what's it like have you seen differences in your own intimate conversation with yourself and your world?
Don't know. I mean, I feel in a way like I've been so single focused and busy over the last 2 years of doing Rebel Wisdom that I haven't really had that much. Yeah, I feel like in many ways my world is kind of, it's certainly expanded in terms of the people that I'm talking to and conversations I'm having, mostly online, but yeah, not so much. Yeah, I don't feel that I've had time to sort of stop and feel into whether things are fundamentally shifting in terms of who I am. I mean, I guess I feel more sort of confident and aligned in my purpose and my sense of direction. And that does feel like a sort of very physical thing, a sort of visceral thing.
Yeah, I noticed that you sat back to answer that question. I appreciated that. Yeah, and like when you said, yeah, I actually haven't had much time to even kind of sit back and check that out. But like when you just do, I would just imagine like I think the thing I want to just acknowledge is just the intelligibility that has been on a pulse, and it has been deeply absorbed in and adjusting and responding to something that's been really, what I'm hearing is been true for you probably for a long time, right? And so I just appreciate that. I appreciate all the adjustments that you're making, but I also really do think, my sense is, you do occupy a very rare position, right? In that you are of both worlds, right? While being interested in what's happening and having a meta awareness of like, there's some shift happening, and you are the one who's been shifting and having that conversation. I just noticed in my conversation with you, I want to get that talking, because you do occupy, I think, a really rare position. And I appreciate that about you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't know many people from Channel 4 News who don't think I've gone totally crazy.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, who are you to them now? Like, if you have a general sense of it, like, are you crazy? Are you like renegade? Are you what?
Yeah.
How do they talk about you when?
Well, because of the Glitch in the Matrix film that was critical of Channel 4 and Kathy Newman, I haven't heard from many of them for a very long time. That was, and I knew putting that out would create that reaction.
Yeah.
I was mindful. I mean, it wasn't attacking them, but like, it wasn't attacking them too much, but I knew that would end my career with them, and probably with the sort of mainstream more generally. I have heard from someone who came to one of our events, said, he mentioned that he was coming to our event, and someone said, "Oh, he's the guy who's banned from Channel 4." Actually banned from ITN, I should say.
Oh, interesting.
Which is who made Channel 4 News.
Oh, interesting.
So,
what's that like for you?
Yeah, I feel a bit misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
by them. And I do wonder whether there's anyone there who kind of recognizes what I was trying to say. I don't know.
Yeah. Have you reached out to any of them? Any of them?
Not really. Not really. I've got a couple of friends still there who I sometimes send story ideas and stuff to, but that's about it.
Right. What do you think would happen if you reached out to them and just started to have the conversation with them about what that was like for them, or started to bridge, like bring some of them on your show or go over there? Like,
Well,
as you talk about it, I feel kind of tender. Like something tender in me happens, like as we're talking about that.
Well, it's difficult because who would that be? They've got corporate responsibilities. They've got, it would be difficult to have an open public conversation about it because they wouldn't want to go there. They didn't want to go there with like I was trying to broker a conversation between Kathy and Jordan after the interview blew up, and they didn't want to go there then. So I don't think they want to go there now.
Right. Right. When you said, I really felt that couple of things. It's like I felt that when you said, yeah, I don't remember exactly what you said, but I feel a bit misunderstood. All of that, right? And I think why I felt kind of tender there is, like, listening to you, is just actually to what degree actually you have internalized so much of the values of that world that are really still, I can tell they're it's about a deep integrity, right? And so you are really being deeply integrous to yourself here. And then a lot of the people that you shared that with, and a history, right? You are no longer talking with you, or when you've reached out, they go, I just feel a loneliness there somehow, like a loneliness, or does that feel correct? Or just something there that's just deeper.
Yeah. I guess I do feel misunderstood by, there's a part of me always, I guess, that sort of thinks, I wonder if any of my former colleagues ever watch some of the stuff that I put out, especially recently, and think, actually, this is worthwhile and the sort of stuff that we should be doing.
Right. Huh. So just hearing yourself just say that, what's that like? Oh.
You've frozen. Oh, yeah. You're back.
Yeah, totally. I thought you froze.
Someone froze.
Well, I'm just noticing that I have an urge to, I have an urge to bring that world and your world into conversation and dialogue. I just think that would be really, really interesting.
Well, there is a conversation that needs to happen. Like, we are in touch with people who want to bring some of the stuff that we've been talking about into government. I think this is the kind of time for, like, the deeper systemic thinking and the idea of paradigm shift. Like, people are willing to have those kind of conversations while it's most clear that a lot of the old ways are breaking down. So that is a sense of, that's an ongoing conversation. Like, how do we bring these worlds back together?
Yeah. 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 Interesting. It's just, I think I'm just appreciating how personal it is for you. Of course, like you're venturing off into new work, you're breaking new ground, right? And where you came from, a lot of the people that you probably really looked up to and had deep relationships with, at least professionally, you're out here and you don't know whether or not they actually see you, right? They see what you're doing as valid, right? And just
Yeah,
the reckoning of that, the reckoning of that. I
yeah,
would imagine it would be a little bit. If I were you, anyways, I would personally be kind of confronted to go back and ask them, right? Because on some level, if I looked up to them, right, like I wouldn't want, I wouldn't, I'd be willing to, but
mm,
it wouldn't look real comfortable to open myself up to my own self doubt that would be triggered in all of that, you know?
yeah, yeah. And there's this sort of sense of, yeah, people who I've respected, and also people with quite a kind of big public profile.
Yeah.
If you're kind of watching people like Jon Snow or Krishnan Guru Murthy, who
Mm-hmm.
British people will know, you know that they probably think that you've gone completely mental and you want to prove that you haven't.
Yes, totally. It's like a line. It's like a line to sink into. So I think what I'm actually realizing is like one of the things that I know that for me, in my own way, since I started doing these conversations, it's kind of taken off a life of its own. But there
Mm,
really is a particular quality of vulnerability that comes with this, um,
mm,
like that's hard to describe. And I think it's just that have knowing that there's people who are watching you that you don't have a relationship with, that are informed by you in ways that you don't quite totally know about, right?
mm.
And so it's just been strange to it's a strange vulnerability to meet people who know a lot about you that you don't know anything about them. That's a really weird, that's a strange, I don't know, it strikes me as
It's a weird dynamic.
it's a weird dynamic, right? But there is I do feel the sense of that there is a responsibility there as well, right? um to understand where they're coming from and like listen to them, and like there's there I can really kind of get that sense of that like, oh yeah, I am on some level, my identity isn't just over here, it's a conversation that's happening with, right, it's a back and forth. Because I know that for me, and I think there's a lot of people, you could probably relate to this as well, it's like, you start following people online, right, over a period of time, and you kind of walk around with them, right? You think about what they were saying, like you hold arguments and tensions that they're holding, and then you see the world through those things, and then you watch the next video and the next conversation, and it's a they start to become guests in your psyche, if you will, that become really, really integrated, right? So to be one of those people on some level, or to be, in your case, in a lot of cases, providing access to those people on some level, you, we are being hosted, in people's nervous systems and levels that they're not even aware of. So it's an unusual position to be in, and there is a vulnerability to it. And I think it's like for you too, there's even more of one, because you come from a background that's in many ways like in many ways you're moving out of and towards the new thing, right? That, like, so there's like lots of human things happening for you. So I just appreciate the work you're doing and acknowledge you for it.
Yeah, thank you, Guy. This has been a really interesting conversation. So thank you for taking me into areas that I wasn't necessarily expecting.
Yeah.